By early spring 1943, occupied France had become a complex landscape of hidden resistance, constant inspections, sudden arrests, and tightening control imposed by the German administration. Within this atmosphere, women's units of the resistance began to play an increasingly important role. Their presence attracted far less attention, allowing them to undertake high-risk assignments, carrying messages, mapping covert routes for moving supplies, and maintaining communication between scattered resistance groups. Outwardly, they appeared to be ordinary residents of towns and villages, and precisely this unremarkable facade made them indispensable. Around Lyon, amid disrupted transportation routes, curfews, and frequent document checks, a group of women from a local resistance network took on tasks involving the transmission of intelligence on German troop movements and the identification of vulnerabilities in transport lines. Their work required precision, alertness, and the ability to make rapid decisions. Though they were not directly involved in armed operations, they became an intellectual foundation of the movement, helping coordinate actions with minimal risk. But at the beginning of March, circumstances changed rapidly. German counterintelligence intensified its efforts, following a series of successful railway sabotage missions. The enemy's informant network expanded, and arrests became increasingly common, sometimes triggered by the slightest suspicion of ties to underground activities. Particularly dangerous were the sudden raids on safe houses, accompanied by meticulous searches and close examination of seized possessions. Amid these developments, the group of female couriers in Lyon received an assignment: deliver information on an upcoming transfer of military cargo that could significantly influence Allied planning. Intelligence leaking from depots and supply stations needed to reach resistance leadership before 12 April 1943. The mission seemed achievable, but after the recent crackdowns, the level of danger had risen substantially. Their movements followed coded patterns, disguised as mundane routines: tram rides across the city, brief stops at small shops, transfers to suburban trains. The women relied on proven methods of covert communication, including false bottoms in bags, coded notes hidden within ordinary lists of household items, and prearranged signals indicating danger. Despite their caution, one of the routes was compromised in early April. German forces likely intercepted part of a message that revealed enough to put them on the group's trail. Several resistance operatives were arrested, raising the threat of exposing the entire network. The women understood that every step they took was now under heightened surveillance, and any mistake could jeopardize not only themselves, but the whole operation. Nevertheless, they continued, aware that timely delivery of the intelligence could save many lives. Under these conditions, their resilience, adaptability, and ability to maintain composure became essential. This quiet determination would form the core of a story that would later astonish even those who believed they understood the inner workings of the French resistance. By 10 April 1943, German patrols around Lyon had strengthened inspections at checkpoints and intensified searches along railway routes. For the resistance, interrupting operations was no longer an option. The intelligence that the women needed to deliver remained critically important, and any delay risked undermining coordination with the Allies. Despite the stricter surveillance, the couriers continued moving through familiar routines that blended naturally into their everyday lives. But on that day, one event changed everything. At a checkpoint on the northern outskirts of Lyon, a German patrol was conducting unusually thorough inspections. One of the couriers, carrying encoded information hidden inside the lining of her bag, was subjected to a more detailed search. At first glance, her belongings appeared ordinary, yet an officer from a counterintelligence detachment noticed the unnatural thickness of the inner fabric. This drew suspicion, and she was detained for further questioning. The arrest quickly led to others. German counterintelligence, analyzing her recent movements and contacts, managed to identify individuals connected to her. By evening, raids were conducted against several safe houses previously used for resistance meetings. There, the Germans found fragments of coded messages, partial notes, and maps with marked routes. Although none of the documents provided a complete picture, they gave the Germans enough reason to expand the investigation. The women were brought to an improvised interrogation center housed in a converted administrative building. The site was stark and isolated, with barred windows and minimal furnishings. Here, German officers hoped to extract information that would reveal the structure of the resistance network and prevent future sabotage. To them, the captured women represented potential sources of crucial intelligence. Despite the gravity of the situation, the women maintained steady composure. They had been trained to withstand pressure, relying on carefully constructed cover stories built to withstand scrutiny. Their preparation included mastering consistent narratives and learning to remain calm even when isolated from their group. The resistance leadership had long understood that any arrest could threaten the entire network and therefore trained them meticulously. The hours immediately following the arrest were decisive. German officers, hoping to obtain quick results, used psychological pressure, referencing supposedly incriminating evidence and hinting at statements made by other detainees. They aimed to provoke contradictions or unintended admissions. But the women remained aligned with their prepared explanations, sticking to everyday reasons for their movements. As the night wore on, it became clear that no rapid breakthrough would occur. The Germans remained convinced that the women possessed valuable information, details of an anticipated act of sabotage or courier routes, but their interrogations produced no leads. The women, in turn, understood that protecting this knowledge and buying time for the resistance had become their primary task. By dawn, both sides had settled into a tense stalemate. The outcome of this early phase would shape everything that followed. After the initial failure to obtain quick confessions, the German counterintelligence unit shifted to a more structured and analytical approach. The officers refrained from applying extreme pressure, aware that excessive force often produced unreliable information. Instead, they focused on building chains of indirect evidence, cross-checking statements, and studying the behavior of the detainees in detail. Maintaining the credibility of the investigation required a methodical pace, and this approach was considered more effective for extracting consistent facts. Investigators began compiling extensive dossiers on each woman, examining their backgrounds, their surroundings, and the patterns of their daily routines. Any minor detail could become a starting point for uncovering contradictions. The officers mapped their movements across recent months, comparing them to documented resistance activities. Yet this process yielded little. Many of the women's routes matched those of any typical resident of Lyon, making it difficult to isolate suspicious behavior. Meanwhile, the women adhered strictly to their pre-established survival strategies. They relied on carefully constructed cover stories, built from everyday routines and believable obligations tied to family, work, and household needs. Each narrative was prepared in advance and aligned with those of the others, ensuring that no accidental inconsistencies could be used against them. This produced a smooth, coherent picture that appeared entirely ordinary. Investigators grew increasingly frustrated, convinced that a well-organized structure was hidden beneath the surface but unable to expose it. Particular attention fell on the notes and maps seized during the raids. Yet these documents were incomplete, fragmented, and offered no definitive leads. Many of the markings on the maps could easily refer to common travel routes, and the short handwritten notes resembled routine reminders. Only a few items hinted at resistance activity, but they lacked context and therefore could not support a formal accusation. As interrogations continued, the Germans attempted a new tactic, presenting the women with lists of already detained individuals and implying that those detainees had provided information. The officers hoped to provoke emotional reactions or create a sense of inevitability. Such methods often destabilized less prepared prisoners. But these women recognized the psychological ploy and remained composed, refusing to deviate from their agreed-upon explanations. The interrogators then shifted toward highly detailed questioning. They examined time intervals in the women's daily movements, their social contacts, and minor logistical details related to their routines. But the detainees met each question with precise and consistent explanations, demonstrating an impressive grasp of the narratives they had crafted. Beyond the interrogation center, events were unfolding that the women could only guess at. The resistance network, alerted by the initial arrests, quickly redesigned its routes and accelerated the transfer of the intelligence concerning the German cargo. Unbeknownst to the detainees, their silence was buying exactly the time needed for the operation to be completed. Inside the interrogation center, tension grew as German officers struggled to reconcile their lack of progress with mounting pressure from superiors. They understood that each passing day reduced their chances of disrupting the resistance's broader strategy. The fear of releasing the women without solid findings weighed heavily, yet no new evidence emerged. By late April, the investigation had reached a critical point. The Germans began considering the use of new psychological methods, ones that relied on subtle manipulation rather than force, hoping to finally break the stalemate. By mid-April, the interrogations of the captured resistance couriers entered a new phase. Realizing the limitations of the information gathered so far, German investigators shifted focus toward broader circumstances connected to sabotage activity across the region. They reviewed recent incidents, examined traces left at disrupted railway lines, and reassessed the incomplete intelligence regarding a military shipment that had proven difficult to track. These factors strengthened the belief that the detained women held crucial knowledge concealed behind carefully crafted stories. The investigation took a new turn when a report arrived from a patrol unit monitoring a railway line south of Lyon. According to the report, shortly before the arrests, a small group had been seen inspecting the tracks and the approaches to a bridge. The patrol had not been able to identify them, but German command suspected a link to the resistance. Investigators began comparing the women's movements with the timing of the sighting. Yet this new angle quickly met the same obstacle as the earlier ones. The women's alibis and routines had been designed to blend seamlessly with their everyday lives. Their movements coincided with common errands, family visits, and routine tasks. Every date, location, and time frame had been rehearsed. Thus, even though the investigators believed they had uncovered a lead, the evidence remained circumstantial at best. Inside the interrogation center, signs of uncertainty were becoming more visible. Investigators began repeating earlier questions, searching for even the slightest discrepancy. But the women remained steady, closely following their prepared accounts. Their training emphasized emotional control, and they showed no signs of confusion or fatigue. At the same time, German command received troubling news. In the area around Bourg-en-Bresse, another act of sabotage had disrupted a supply line. Although no evidence linked this incident directly to the detainees, its timing deepened the concern that the resistance network continued to operate without interruption. This strengthened the belief that the women were only part of a larger organizational structure, which made the continuing interrogations appear increasingly ineffective. As the new reports accumulated, doubts within the German administration grew. Traditional investigative methods had produced no results, and analytical efforts were failing to uncover contradictions. Some officers began questioning whether the detainees had been mistakenly drawn into a broader operation aimed at dismantling the resistance. Despite the ongoing uncertainty, German command maintained observation, aware that even an unsuccessful interrogation could contribute to understanding resistance tactics. But as the investigation dragged on, it became clear that each additional attempt to apply pressure only reinforced the women's composure. The investigation had reached a turning point. The Germans were running out of leads, and the detainees continued to withstand the pressure with unwavering steadiness. During the second half of April, the confrontation between the detained women and the German interrogators evolved into a subtle intellectual duel. Realizing that straightforward pressure was ineffective, German command decided to analyze the psychological traits of each detainee more closely. They began paying attention not only to the women's answers, but also to the smallest reactions, changes in posture, pauses, and shifts in tone. The goal was to identify emotional weak points or hidden inconsistencies. Yet this was precisely where the women's greatest strength emerged. Their training had prepared them not only to memorize cover stories, but also to maintain strict control over their demeanor. They knew the interrogators were looking for hesitation or discomfort, and so they avoided even the slightest revealing gesture. Their responses remained consistent and rooted in everyday details that could not be easily disproven. To widen the scope of their investigation, the Germans incorporated information from external sources. They reviewed gendarmerie reports, transportation logs, and witness statements in the hope of finding even a minor clue linking the women to the resistance. But these materials were fragmented, unreliable, or too general to support any concrete claims. Every piece of information that appeared promising ultimately required verification, and such verification was rarely possible. One of the key episodes involved the analysis of the women's travel routes between January and April 1943. The investigators tried to detect hidden patterns, but soon discovered that the routes were indistinguishable from those used daily by ordinary residents of Lyon. Moreover, the women had intentionally varied their routes and schedules to avoid leaving recognizable traces. Even detailed transportation records and patrol observations failed to reveal anything conclusive. Meanwhile, the resistance had already taken full advantage of the time the women had gained. The network rerouted its couriers, reinforced operational security, and completed the crucial task of tracking the German military shipment. By mid-April, the information had reached the Allies. Though the detainees remained unaware of this success, their silence had directly contributed to its achievement. The Germans increasingly sensed that time was slipping away. Their inability to extract useful information posed a dilemma. They could neither justify continued detention nor find grounds for formal charges. Some officers began suggesting that the women might have been swept up in the wrong operation, caught on the periphery of a much larger resistance network. Even so, command insisted on maintaining careful observation, arguing that the interrogations still held analytical value. Yet as attempts to provoke inconsistencies continued to fail, tensions grew. Every new round of questioning only made it clearer that the detainees were not going to break. Their resilience became one of the most defining elements of the entire investigation. By late April, the interrogators found themselves in a situation where each passing day brought them no closer to answers. The stalemate persisted, and pressure was beginning to turn inward, not toward the detainees, but toward the investigators themselves. By the end of April, German command recognized that the investigation had reached a dead end. Despite sustained interrogations, analytical reviews, and attempts to uncover even minor contradictions, the detained women continued to display unwavering composure. None of the evidence presented was strong enough to support charges, and every action or movement from their past could be explained by ordinary circumstances. This created growing tension within the interrogation center, where each session had become as taxing for the investigators as for the detainees. At the same time, reports spread through the region of new acts of resistance. In the areas around Mâcon and further east, sabotage disrupted communication lines between German garrisons. Although there was no direct evidence linking these incidents to the detainees, their occurrence heightened the anxiety of German command. It suggested that the resistance network was more extensive than previously assumed, and that the arrested women might hold a far smaller role within it than initially believed. Inside the interrogation center, the methods of questioning shifted again. Investigators began relying on longer, slower conversations focused on everyday topics, hoping that fatigue from extended discussions would provoke mistakes. This tactic had worked on other detainees in the past. Yet the women were prepared for this as well. Their training emphasized how to endure prolonged psychological pressure without showing visible signs of exhaustion. Repetition, attempts to create a false sense of familiarity, and subtle probing produced no slip-ups. One moment seemed promising for the investigators. A minor inconsistency appeared in one woman's account concerning the time frame of a particular trip. German officers believed they had finally identified a vulnerability. However, when they followed up with transportation schedules, patrol logs, and witness observations, the inconsistency dissolved. The route matched common civilian activity, and the timeline held up. What seemed at first like a breakthrough turned into another dead end. Meanwhile, the detainees sensed a shift. They could not know the results of external events, but they observed that interrogations became less intense. The pauses between questioning sessions grew longer, the inquiries less sharp, and the overall urgency faded. These subtle changes indicated that the investigators were losing confidence in the value of further efforts. By late April, a crucial development occurred. An analytical report circulated within German command, concluding that the detained women did not pose an immediate threat. The report suggested that their arrests might have been part of a broader sweep aimed at dismantling the resistance, but that insufficient evidence existed to continue holding them. Although it recommended maintaining cautious surveillance, the document effectively declared the interrogation phase complete. At that moment, the women unknowingly achieved a decisive victory. They had revealed nothing, no names, no routes, no operational details. Their silence had allowed the resistance to complete its mission and relay intelligence to the Allies. Though they were unaware of the full impact, their endurance had influenced the course of operations far beyond the confines of the interrogation center. Their invisible victory was not celebrated, not recorded in official archives, and not recognized by the enemy. Yet it shaped the outcome of the resistance effort during one of its most critical phases. By the beginning of May 1943, German command had significantly reduced the pressure surrounding the case. Reports from different units confirmed the absence of solid evidence linking the detained women to resistance operations. Suspicion lingered, but the growing need to allocate resources to other regions, especially those where sabotage activity was intensifying, forced the administration to reconsider its priorities. Gradually, the investigation was curtailed. However, releasing the detainees could not be done abruptly or quietly. The occupation authorities needed to preserve an appearance of control. Therefore, the process was carried out through formal, carefully structured procedures. Each woman was summoned for a final administrative interview, intended not to extract information, but to impress upon her the importance of adhering to regulations and avoiding involvement in any questionable activities. These conversations followed a rigid official tone, with no signs of coercion. German command sought to underline that the women would remain under observation even after their release. The women understood that freedom did not mean safety. They were aware that surveillance would likely continue, and any deviation from their established routines might draw renewed suspicion. Each step taken outside the interrogation center now required the same caution they had demonstrated during their missions. They had to reintegrate into their everyday lives without contradicting the stories they had upheld so consistently under interrogation. The first days after release were among the most delicate. Returning to familiar neighborhoods meant confronting the curiosity of neighbors, shopkeepers, and acquaintances who wondered about their absence. Some women had to present their detention as an administrative misunderstanding. Others had to provide explanations to relatives in a way that aligned with their prepared legends. Every gesture had to remain natural, every detail carefully balanced to avoid attracting improper attention. The resistance network, aware of the women's release, began restoring contact with them, but with extreme caution. Communication took place through indirect channels, brief encounters in markets, messages left at predetermined locations, or intermediaries unknown to German intelligence. Before reintegrating the women into operations, resistance leaders monitored them discreetly, ensuring that no German surveillance was active. Their movements, routines, and interactions were assessed with meticulous care. Despite the risks, The women remained committed. They understood that their earlier silence had contributed to a successful operation and that the struggle was far from over. Their experiences inside the interrogation center had strengthened the network by providing valuable insights into the enemy's methods. As the resistance resumed coordination, the women prepared to re-enter the clandestine structure with heightened vigilance. By mid-May, the situation shifted once more. German forces began redirecting their attention towards sabotage actions occurring deeper within the central zone. This reduced the resources available for monitoring individuals previously detained. As oversight weakened, the women found opportunities to resume more active involvement, albeit under stricter operational protocols. Their return to the shadows marked not just a continuation of their work, but a demonstration of the resilience that defined the resistance movement. Their ability to withstand interrogation and then quietly rejoin the struggle illustrated how endurance, composure, and disciplined anonymity could become decisive factors in the broader fight. By the summer of 1943, the resistance networks operating around Lyon and throughout the surrounding regions had entered a new stage of activity. Railway sabotage intensified, intelligence on German troop movements became more precise, and coordination with Allied forces gained momentum. Within this expanding web of underground operations, the recently released women became crucial components of the resistance infrastructure. Their ability to endure pressure during interrogation quietly demonstrated their value as reliable and resilient operatives. After their release, their work resumed under stricter security protocols. The resistance avoided all direct, traceable contact. Information moved through multi-layered channels. Each woman received only the details necessary for her specific task. This compartmentalization made the network far less vulnerable. It also turned the women into essential couriers who maintained discreet communication and logistical continuity among dispersed resistance cells. Meanwhile, German counterintelligence struggled to regain control. The lack of actionable information from the detainees hindered efforts to map the resistance structure. Officers were forced to acknowledge that the absence of confessions had allowed the underground network to remain largely intact. The smooth consistency of the women's stories created the impression that they played a minor or peripheral role, which only further misled the investigative teams. At the same time, the intelligence that the women had helped protect proved influential. The Allies, having received the details of the German cargo route earlier in the spring, incorporated the information into operational planning. By June, it became clear that the timely transfer of this intelligence had shaped actions on the Southern Front. The women themselves did not know how far the impact of their silence had reached, but the resistance around them began working with renewed confidence, strengthened by the success of their covert efforts. Throughout June, the women resumed gathering detailed observations, rail schedules, bridge conditions, patrol routines, cargo movements, and patterns in local German transportation flows. These small fragments of intelligence, passed discreetly through established channels, formed the backbone of the resistance's situational awareness. Their movements remained cautious. Their behavior was deliberately ordinary. Each action adhered to the discipline that had helped them survive interrogation. Over time, their experience became an informal model for new recruits. Resistance leaders recognized the importance of their example. The lessons they conveyed, how to maintain psychological stability under pressure, how to uphold a consistent story, and how to manage fear, were passed down quietly through trusted intermediaries. These teachings expanded the network's resilience in the face of escalating German countermeasures. By the end of 1943, the episode that had unfolded inside the interrogation center had faded from public memory. There were no official accounts, no recorded testimonies, and no documents that captured the full significance of what the women had accomplished. Yet their silence had influenced the outcome of a critical operation and helped fortify the resistance at a pivotal moment. The Germans, despite their resources, never uncovered their true roles and were unable to halt the chain of events their resilience had set in motion. The legacy of their actions endured not in archives or reports, but in the invisible outcomes that shaped the resistance's evolution. It lived on, in lives preserved, in missions completed, and in the hidden victories that formed the foundation of broader Allied successes. In a war where every detail could shift the course of events, the unwavering resolve of a few women became a decisive factor. Their story, largely unseen and undocumented, proved how quiet endurance could alter the direction of history just as powerfully as open conflict.